To check out the starch tools, let's take a look at this number 6 composition that has a small hand in it. This hand is simply just a green hand with some puppet pins already in it. We'll fit this to the window by using Option and the / or Alt and the / on a PC. We'll open up the layer and check out the rig for the puppet tools as they're attached to this layer. I may need to zoom in just a little bit, so I'll use the period on the keyboard. Now I can see all of the pins on the hand, and I can move them around by simply hovering over them and dragging them around. We'll open up the puppet properties even further. We'll see that underneath the mesh, not only are there the deformation pins, the yellow puppet pins, but also a category for stiffness. Now under stiffness, there are several pins that have been set up to define the stiffness for areas in the mesh of the hand. I'll use the comma key to scale the window down a little bit. In order to see them, let's check out the tool, Puppet Starch Tool. Here on the original mesh, you can see that they're set up along the forearm and one at the base of the middle finger. Just like the overlap pins, the starch pin has an extent, and the extent value will cover a certain amount of triangulation inside of our mesh. However, the starch tool has an amount value to hold back the influence of the deformation caused by the yellow pins. We'll go ahead and add some more starch pins by clicking over the original mesh shape, and by clicking on it we can see that the amount and the value of the extent changes the way that the deformation occurs along each finger. By changing the amount of stiffness, you can change the property of that triangulation from something that is more rigid to something that is more jelly-like. I'll go ahead and move this pin up to the top of the finger and change the amount for this pin down to something much lower. Now if I move back to my puppet pin tool and move the puppet pins, each one of those starch areas will behave differently than if I don't have any starch values at all. The most obvious of them all is probably down here in the forearm. Again, we'll go back to the starch tool and simply click on each one of these pins to reveal the number. This one is starch 3. I'll use the delete key or the backspace button to remove that pin. I'll do the same for all of the pins on the forearm. Without those pins, you can see how the forearm bends and contorts with the movement of the pins on the thumb. In order to prevent that from happening, I simply created 3 pins along the forearm. However, once we create the new starch pins by clicking on the position in the original mesh, nothing appears to happen. That's because the amount, the value for each one of these pins, is set to -24. We need to create a value that is higher. We'll change this value to something around 15. By changing to something on the positive side, we're creating a much more rigid forearm, allowing less of the deformation from the yellow pins to affect those areas lower in the mesh. Next, let's take a look at comp number 7, Motion Sketch. If you click on the layer, you can see there are several keyframes laid out with a seemingly regular pattern. If we open up the parameter for position, we can see the keyframes laid out. Rather than trying to set keyframes manually as we have in the past, we'll delete all of the keyframes on this layer by clicking on the stopwatch once, then Control-click or right-click on the word Position, then reset the values for that parameter. We can see in the effects controls that the puppet effect is already applied to this layer. By revealing the effect in the timeline, we can see that we have the puppet effect on our layer, but there aren't any puppet pins, overlap pins, or even starch pins on the effect.